The moment Nadia realized the man she had just thrown a glass of wine on was standing at the front of the boardroom the next morning, introducing himself as the new managing partner of her firm, she seriously considered faking a medical emergency and never coming back. It had started the night before at her colleague Priya's engagement party. Nadia had never been the kind of person who enjoyed crowded venues with thumping music and overpriced cocktails. But Priya had been her closest friend since their first year at the firm, and she wasn't going to miss it. She arrived at Vertigo, one of those rooftop bars in downtown Toronto, where the view was gorgeous and the drinks were deliberately small, wearing a navy-wrap dress and flat boots, because she had learned long ago to dress for the exit, not the entrance. Everything was fine until she spotted a man cornering Priya near the railing at the far edge of the terrace. Priya's smile had gone tight. That particular smile Nadia recognized immediately, the one that didn't reach her eyes, the one she used when she was trying to stay polite and slowly losing the battle. The man was tall, well-dressed and leaning too close. His hand had found the small of Priya's back in a way that clearly hadn't been invited. Nadia didn't think. She picked up the nearest glass, crossed the terrace in about 6 seconds, and poured the contents directly onto his jacket. He stepped back. She stepped forward. "She's engaged," Nadia said, "to someone else. Have a good night." The man stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not angry, not embarrassed, just surprised, like someone who hadn't been caught off guard in a very long time. Priya grabbed her arm and pulled her away before anything else could happen, whispering that he was probably just someone's cousin, and she might have overreacted slightly. Nadia spent the rest of the party convinced she hadn't. She didn't think about him again until the following morning. Sycamore and Bell was a mid-sized corporate law firm in the financial district, the kind of place where the carpets were expensive and the politics were more expensive still. Nadia had been a senior associate for 2 years, having joined straight out of Osgood, and she was quietly, carefully building the kind of track record that led to partnership. She was 32, precise in her work, and largely indifferent to office drama, which was precisely why her stomach dropped when she walked into the all-staff meeting and recognized the man now standing at the podium. He had changed his jacket. His was dry. His expression, when his eyes found hers across the room, was one of measured amusement. "My name is Callum Reed," he said to the room. "I'll be stepping in as managing partner effective immediately." Nadia sat very still in her chair while her colleague Bex leaned over and whispered, "He's gorgeous, isn't he? Single too, apparently." Nadia smiled in a way that she hoped looked normal. She spent the rest of the morning half expecting a summons. It didn't come. By noon, she had convinced herself that perhaps he hadn't recognized her in the low light of a rooftop bar, that the whole thing was already forgotten, that she was going to be completely fine. At 2 o'clock, his assistant stopped by her desk with a polite smile and said that Mr. Reed would like to see her at her earliest convenience. Nadia took the long way around to the senior offices, past the kitchen and the boardroom windows, buying herself an extra 60 seconds to get her thoughts in order. She knocked twice, heard a calm voice say, "Come in," and pushed the door open. Callum Reed was standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the lake. He turned when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Close the door, please," he said. She did. "Ms." He glanced down at the folder on his desk. "Nadia Ashworth. That's senior associate. 7 years at the firm. Excellent record." He looked up. "Glass of Sauvignon Blanc, $45. Nadia felt heat rise in her face. "I can write you a check, that won't be necessary." He was quiet for a moment, and then something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. "For what it's worth, I wasn't bothering your friend. She spilled something on her dress and I was trying to help her get to the washroom without making a scene. I'm Priya's fiancé's older brother." The floor seemed to drop about 2 inches beneath Nadia's feet. "Oh," she said, "yes, so you were helping her." She pressed her lips together. "I see." Callum picked up a pen and tapped it once against the desk. "I'm not going to hold it against you professionally. What happened last night has nothing to do with this office." He paused. "I do think, however, that you owe me a drink." Nadia blinked. "I'm sorry. You ruined my jacket and threw wine at a stranger's. The least you can do is replace the drink." He said it completely evenly, as though he were discussing a filing deadline. "Friday, after work. There's a wine bar on King Street." She stopped. "I don't think that's appropriate. You threw wine on your managing partner at a party." "That's a fair point," she admitted. She went home that evening and called her mother in Kingston, leaving out the part about the wine and the boardroom and the Friday invitation, and spending 40 minutes instead, listening to her mother, Ask when she was going to stop working herself into the ground and find someone worth finding. Her mother had been saying some version of this for 5 years. Nadia had been deflecting for just as long. She had made her peace with that. She had decided very deliberately, at some point in her late 20s, that the version of her life she wanted didn't require the complication of another person at the center of it. She had watched two of her closest friends from law school go through brutal divorces before 35. She had watched her aunt put 3 decades into a marriage that left her exhausted and half invisible. Nadia had looked at all of this evidence and drawn a perfectly reasonable conclusion. It worked fine, most of the time. The following months at Sycamore and Bell settled into a rhythm that Nadia hadn't entirely expected. Callum Reed turned out to be a different kind of managing partner than she'd imagined when he first walked into that boardroom. Less interested in the theater of authority, more focused on actual results. He didn't micromanage, he listened. He had a habit of asking questions in meetings that made people think he already knew the answer, which he usually did. He also had a habit of stopping by her desk on his way to the kitchen, not to give her work, just to ask what she was reading, or whether the Castellano contract had moved forward, and then standing there for a few minutes more than strictly necessary. Bex noticed before Nadia did. "He doesn't do that with anyone else," Bex said one afternoon, watching him disappear around the corner. "He's new. He's getting to know the team. He knows Marcus's name because he read the org chart. He knows yours because he remembers things you've mentioned twice." Bex raised an eyebrow. "There's a difference." Nadia said nothing and went back to her brief. The firm's annual gala was held each November at the Royal Ontario Museum. Nadia had attended every year without particular enthusiasm. It was the kind of event where you wore heels that hurt and made conversation with clients you would spend the next 12 months corresponding with entirely by email. This year, Callum sent a brief note to the senior associates asking that they each plan to attend with a +1 if possible. As the client table arrangements required even numbers, Nadia did not have a +1. She was going to ask Bex to come as her guest when Callum appeared in her office doorway on a Tuesday afternoon, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, a stack of folders under his arm. "I hear you haven't confirmed a guest for the gala," he said. "Your assistant is very thorough." "She is." He leaned against the doorframe. "Come with me." Nadia set down her pen. "You're asking me to be your guest at the firm's own gala. I'm the managing partner. I'm allowed to have a guest." "Callum, it's a client event. You know half the room. It makes sense practically." He looked at her steadily. "And I'd like to spend the evening with you. Both of those things are true." She went. She would look back later and understand that the decision was made somewhere in the pause before she answered, in the part of her that had already stopped pretending she didn't notice when he walked into a room. The museum was beautiful that night, the main hall lit in warm gold, the hum of a string quartet drifting up from somewhere near the west entrance. Callum introduced her to clients she hadn't met before, stood beside her through 3 rounds of cocktails, and spent 20 minutes in animated conversation with an architect from Vancouver before finding her again near the coat check and handing her a glass of water without being asked. "How did you know I needed that?" she said. "You've been on your feet in those shoes for 2 hours, and you've been quiet for the last 20 minutes, which means you're tired." He shrugged slightly. "I pay attention." Outside afterward, the November air was cold and clean. He had a car waiting. Of course he did, but they stood on the steps for a moment longer than necessary, neither of them quite moving toward it. He gave her a single white rose he'd picked up from one of the centerpieces when he thought she wasn't looking. She pretended she hadn't seen him do it. "Nadia," he said. Just her name, quietly, in the cold air. "I know," she said. "Do you?" She looked at him. "I've been trying not to." He smiled at that, a real one, unhurried, with something warm underneath it. "I know you have." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, and she let him. "I've noticed that too." "In the car," she said yes before he even finished asking the question properly. He laughed, surprised, and she felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she'd been carrying. For so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. The problem arrived in the form of a phone call from Priya on a Sunday morning 3 weeks later. Nadia had been seeing Callum quietly. Dinners after work, a Saturday at the market, long phone calls on the nights they didn't see each other. And she hadn't told Priya yet because it felt fragile still, like something she didn't want to say out loud before she understood it herself. "I need to tell you something," Priya said. "About Callum." Nadia sat up straighter. "What about him?" "Jonah mentioned it to me last night and I didn't know how to bring it up." Priya hesitated. "Before he came back to Toronto, he was serious with someone in Vancouver. Like, very serious. Jonah thinks he was going to propose." A pause. She chose someone else, another colleague of theirs. And the reason he's back here, the reason he took this job, Jonah thinks he was running from it. Nadia sat with that for a long time after the call ended. She didn't say anything to Callum that evening, or the next day. She started making small excuses. A brief that ran late, a client call that couldn't move. She stopped lingering in the hallways. She told herself she was just being careful, being sensible. This was what sensible looked like. After a week and a half of this, Callum showed up at her office door at 6 in the evening when everyone else had left, closed the door quietly behind him and said, "What happened?" "Nothing happened." "Nadia." She looked at her desk. "I heard about Vancouver." He was quiet for a moment. "Jonah, he wasn't wrong, was he? About any of it?" Callum came and sat in the chair across from her desk. Not the power side, the other side, the one clients used. "No," he said, "he wasn't wrong." He was quiet, and the honesty of it settled between them before he spoke again. "It took me a long time to trust that kind of thing again. And then I threw wine on a stranger at a party, and she spent 4 months making me feel like." He stopped. "I'm not running from anything. Not anymore. But I understand if that's hard to believe." Nadia didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't throw wine on me. I threw it on you. I know. I was being poetic." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest unclenched, very slowly, like a door being opened from the inside. "I don't want to be someone's reset button," she said quietly. "You're not." He leaned forward. "You're the reason I stopped needing one." She believed him. She would think about that later, about how she knew, in that specific moment, sitting in a mostly dark office on a Tuesday evening in November, that she believed him without reservation. It wasn't logic, it wasn't evidence. It was something closer to recognition. They kept things quiet at work for another month, until Priya found out and immediately told approximately everyone she trusted, which meant the whole firm knew within a week. Nadia expected to feel exposed. She mostly felt, to her own surprise, relieved. Her mother called on a Thursday. "Priya's mother called me," she said, not even attempting subtlety. "She says you've been seeing someone, Mom. She says he's Jonah's brother. She says he's a lawyer. He's my managing partner, actually." A very long pause. "Nadia Elizabeth Ashworth. It's fine. You threw wine on him at a party and now you're dating him. In my defense, I thought I was helping Priya." Her mother made a noise that was somewhere between exasperation and delight. "I've been waiting 6 years for you to bring someone home, and now I find out from Priya's mother." She paused. "Bring him to Christmas. I mean it. If you show up alone, I'm not cooking." Nadia laughed despite herself. "You'll cook. You always cook." "Don't push me." Winter arrived with particular certainty in Toronto that year, the kind that settled in before December and didn't apologize for it. Nadia and Callum had fallen into the easy rhythm of people who had stopped pretending they weren't already sharing a life in most of the ways that mattered. He knew she needed the window seat in restaurants. She knew he took his coffee wrong and had stopped bothering to correct him. He drove her to Kingston one weekend to see her parents, and her mother opened the door, looked at him for approximately 4 seconds, and said, "I like him," directly to Nadia as though Callum couldn't hear her. "Thank you," Callum said. I wasn't talking to you," her mother said pleasantly, and then handed him a dish towel and told him the potatoes needed draining. They drove home that Sunday with the heater on and the radio low, and Nadia watched the highway disappear behind them and thought about something her mother had said quietly in the kitchen, while Callum was in the other room talking hockey with her father. "The ones worth keeping are the ones who feel like rest, not work." She had filed that away without responding. She thought about it now. He glanced over at her from the driver's seat. "You're quiet. I'm thinking. About what?" She looked at him in the dark of the car, the passing lights catching the side of his face. "About the fact that I was going to stay single forever." He smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "How's that going?" "Poorly," she said. "Terribly, in fact. I'm sorry to hear it." She was not sorry in the least. The trouble with things going quietly well is that trouble doesn't announce itself. It arrived 6 weeks later, in the form of a message from a blocked number on Callum's phone, which Nadia only knew about because he showed it to her himself, setting the phone face up on the kitchen counter one evening without explanation, waiting for her to read it. It was from the woman in Vancouver. She was moving back to Toronto. She said she'd made a mistake. She said she wanted to talk. Nadia read it once and set the phone back down. "I haven't replied," he said. "I know. You just showed it to me. I wanted you to know before I did anything." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to tell you that, and I wanted to tell you in person." Nadia stood there for a moment. She had spent the better part of her adult life constructing a version of herself that didn't require this. didn't require handing someone the specific leverage to hurt you, didn't require trusting that they would choose you when a cleaner, simpler option appeared. She had thought that was wisdom, standing in his kitchen, looking at the undeniable fact of him standing there having done the exact right thing before she even had to ask. She thought maybe it was just fear with better posture. "Okay," she said. "That's all? What else do you need me to say?" "Nothing, I suppose." He was quiet. "I just wanted you to know that it isn't a question for me. That's all." She nodded once. She walked around the counter and kissed him on the cheek, and he let out a breath he'd been holding. Things were not immediately simple after that. The woman, her name was Diane, Nadia would later learn, made 2 more attempts at contact over the following months. Callum showed Nadia each one and declined each one, and the pattern of his honesty became something she added to the list of things she trusted about him. She had not expected the list to be so long. She had not expected to be keeping one at all. Spring came late to Toronto that year, the way it sometimes does, teasing the city with a week of warmth before pulling back into cold rain for another month. Nadia was working through a complicated commercial litigation file that had been consuming her since February, and she barely noticed the first tulips in the park across from the office. She noticed when Callum brought her a coffee and stood at her window looking down at them and said, "You've barely left this floor in 2 weeks. The case." "I know about the case. Come for a walk. It's 3 in the afternoon, 30 minutes. He looked at her. "The file will still be here." She went. They walked around the block twice, past the park and the coffee cart and the old church, with the scaffolding that had been there since she started at the firm. He talked about nothing in particular. Something his father had said on a call that morning, a case he'd read about in the news, and she listened and felt the tension in her shoulders release by degrees. On the second loop around, he stopped outside the coffee cart and said, with no lead-up at all, "I want to ask you to marry me." Nadia looked at him. A man behind them asked for an Americano. "You want to," she said carefully. "I am asking," I phrased it badly. He turned to face her fully. "Nadia, will you marry me?" There was no ring. They were on a public sidewalk. He had slightly terrible timing and was absolutely certain, and she could see both of those things on his face with complete clarity. She thought about her mother in the kitchen. She thought about the list she'd been keeping. She thought about a rooftop bar in July and $45 worth of Sauvignon Blanc, and how a single impulsive decision had, somehow, led her directly here. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He smiled, that real smile, the one she'd cataloged the first time she saw it. "Obviously? Don't push it." They told her parents over video call that evening. Her mother cried, which she had been fairly certain would happen. Her father shook Callum's hand through the screen, which was technically impossible and didn't stop him from trying. Priya, who had been waiting for news on a separate chat window with barely concealed impatience, sent a string of messages in rapid succession, and then called Jonah into the room to tell him he owed her $50. Nadia sat on the couch after all of it was over, the apartment quiet again. Callum in the kitchen making tea, because he had apparently decided in the past 6 months that he was a person who made tea in the evenings. She looked around at the evidence of a life she hadn't planned on. His jacket on the hook by the door. His terrible habit of leaving books face down on the coffee table. The particular quiet of a place that no longer felt like hers alone. She thought about the woman she had been at 28-30, who had decided with great certainty that this was not for her. She understood that woman. She did not think that woman had been wrong, exactly, only that she'd been working with incomplete information. The wedding was small and deliberately so. They were married on a Saturday in September at a restored heritage house outside the city, with her parents and his parents and Priya and Jonah, and a handful of people on each side who actually mattered. Her dress was simple and cream-colored, and Callum's suit was a dark navy that reminded her unexpectedly and pleasantly of what she'd been wearing the night they met. He cried, a little at the ceremony. She was not going to mention it unless he brought it up first. They went to Portugal for 2 weeks and came home to Toronto in October, when the leaves had turned and the city had the particular golden gray quality it gets in early autumn. The case she'd been working since February had resolved in her client's favor, and she had been formally recommended for partnership. None of this was what she had planned. All of it was better than what she had planned. Her mother called on a Tuesday morning, ostensibly to ask if they'd eaten properly in Lisbon, actually to hear Nadia's voice and confirm that the happiness she'd heard in it over the past few months was still there. "Are you good?" her mother asked, in that way that meant something larger than the words. Nadia was standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, looking at the street below where a couple was walking a very old dog through a pile of leaves, and Callum was still asleep in the other room, and the whole ordinary morning was spread out in front of her with a particular quiet generosity she had not known she was waiting for. "Yeah, Mom," she said. "I really am."